Well, thank you all for being here. Welcome back to the Be Better Club. This week we're talking about AI ethics and autonomous vehicles, and this is a pretty big landscape. But Dr. Kerr and I chose a couple of podcasts for you, um, focused specifically on self-driving cars. So the first thing to say is, when we're talking about autonomous vehicles, when I talk about this with my students in class, usually we talk about the landscape of autonomous vehicles, which is pretty broad. So the thing we're going to set on the shelf for this afternoon is anything defense related. So we could talk about drone programs and missile defense systems, and all of those are also different types of autonomous vehicles. But what I want to focus on this landscape is sort of the commercial civilian side of autonomous vehicles, which is on the road driving vehicles. But if anybody wants to talk bombs and exploding planes and things, you let us know. We're happy to do that too. The other thing to say is that Dr. Kubler and I, one of the podcasts you listen to is from us, or read, there's a transcript too, through a program we did with WUCF here a couple of years ago now, where we got to do a series of small thinkings together about ethics, and those were really, really fun. So we might ask him to talk about that if he's interested. We got to sit in the studio together in front of mics. It was very fancy. I liked it.
You don't want me to add on to that, do you? Other than it was really fun.
No, go for it. Add on.
Well, we just got to randomly choose our topics, and I guess we tended to choose things that were either topical, like autonomous vehicles, or things that we thought should be topical and talked more about. But it was challenging in some ways because it was only a little 5-minute segment, but in many ways, those are the best things because they force you to try to be succinct and yet still be thoughtful. So we gave it our best shot. And I think we had fun doing the thinking, but this is a great forum to broaden the thinking beyond just our musings.
Yeah, and that's really well said. So the other thing I wanted to mention is the Ethics Talk podcast, Talk Tech podcast. Sorry, EE's Talk Tech podcast is a 2017 discussion of autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars. And Dr. Kubler and I did one in 2019, and here we are in 2021, which feels a million years away for any number of reasons from 2017. So the conversation about self-driving cars continues to expand. The last little sort of introductory distinction I want to make is that we tend, both in scholarly communities and in everyday public discourse, tend to talk about AI like it's one sort of paradigmatic thing that we can think about. But really what we're talking about here are machine learning algorithms, not artificial intelligence systems. I think that's a really important distinction, and I want to just make sure we're clear on what that means. When I think about AI systems, I think about the things that are still science fiction, the sorts of things like autonomous self-learning systems that make decisions on their own. We're not at that point yet. I can't name a single system that's at that point yet. We're still very much in the more and more advanced machine learning algorithms. These are systems whose programs are designed by programmers, whose decisions are pre-built, and whose complexity makes them seem autonomous. And I think, and I might be making too much of that distinction, so y'all should feel free to push back on me, but that's where my head goes when I hear AI, I think, really, AI? Like, not quite.
I think some of the things that end up in the under the hood of self-driving vehicles, yeah, those are definitely more machine learning or programmed machine implemented. Maybe some would push hard on the definition of AI and say things like Deep Blue and other game playing algorithms that have learned through network analysis are effectively AI. Hard to call it intelligent, but at least not pre-programmed, given a structure by which it learns patterns, but it can implement those patterns beyond the construct of known things. So if you kind of have a soft definition of create something new, outside of just a structured language, then maybe AI has been around for quite some time. There's a really neat Scientific American article that I read, I want to say back in maybe 05, 06, I don't remember when, but it was discussing implementations of emerging AI, and a program that had been developed, which really used a genetic algorithm to replace passive electronic components on a circuit board and design new circuits. And so in some sense, it was kind of a maybe a dumb AI in that it was taking patterns and snipping and reconnecting and whatnot. And the author made the point that it came up with some circuits that had appendages that kind of were stupid, things that were short circuited back onto themselves and had no electronic function. And yet it still came up with new circuits, a device, for instance, that could take a cube root of an input voltage, and circuits that had not been around. Okay, so it's interesting to think that still, for a while, we've been making systems that could create something new, even if you would hesitate to call them intelligent. And someone might argue the fact that they created dumb circuit elements and little appendages that didn't do anything, that's not necessarily dumb. We think if you look at evolution, it's pretty smart, but a lot of people are not really sure what the appendix is good for anymore, or earlobes for that matter. I don't know. Maybe I'm overlooking their value, but there's lots of things that are maybe vestiges of evolutionary progress, evolutionary advance, that don't necessarily represent an intelligent adaptation of the organism. So just because there's something that doesn't seem to have a function, if it comes up with something new, you might say, that's a product of an artificial intelligence. There's probably a whole range of hard and soft definitions that we could apply.
Yeah, that's super helpful. The other distinction I keep seeing in the literature is between specific intelligence and general intelligence. So like Deep Blue is described as an ASI, artificial specific intelligence. So it's got a very specific thing it can do. And if you ask it to tell dogs from cats, it's not going to do anything, right? But an artificial general intelligence is the goal of AI. And I think that's more like the humanoid robotics stuff of science fiction, maybe.
Yeah, that's a good point. That one's helpful. I recognize in interacting with my graduate students that I hope what I have can be called general intelligence, and I'm very grateful that they have a lot of specific intelligence.
Good.
I hope this isn't too tangential, but it's kind of going off what Dr. Kubler was talking about previously with the circuit generating algorithm. I'm not sure if any of y'all are familiar with the protein folding algorithms that they've been using to try and combat coronavirus and other kind of approaches for coming up with solutions to diseases. But I encourage you guys to look into a cool project called Folding at Home, which is kind of a crowdsourcing computing power project to combat that using AI.
Cool. Like sort of the same approach to the SETI project, Austin, where you could donate your computing power to look for extraterrestrial life.
Yeah, it's kind of like that, but they in general were, I forget what their original goal was, but I think they kind of rerouted the project to try and combat coronavirus, to where you basically allow them to rent your computing power for free, and then their algorithms do the work on hundreds of thousands or even millions of machines to try and step us closer towards that goal.
I like that we've got choice now how to donate our computing power. We can look for extraterrestrial life. We can work on protein folding. We can mine Bitcoins. It's a landscape of things we can use our computing power for. It's good. Oh, Dr. Kerr has now switched rooms. Very, very fancy. Good change. This preliminary discussion got me thinking about how grumpily I received the Talk Tech podcast. Because they started by using language like, they want to talk about the extent to which the car has a choice, whether it kills the driver or the school children in this podcast. And I was like, the car doesn't have a choice, does it? And this is still an ongoing question for me, because I don't know, that language makes it feel like what we're talking about is something like the car's autonomy, right? Minimally it's agency, but maybe it's free agency. But it still feels weird to me to say the car has a choice, because what's going on is like this ecosystem of decision making where you've got the car's mechanics and the environmental constraints and the driver's input, and then the engineers and the programmers and the designers, and like it's not the car making the choice, is it? He asks in an effort to prod.
So I was fascinated by this. I have a colleague who was working on autonomous systems, and it feels like this is the rote question that comes up when we start talking about AI, especially with vehicles and things of that nature. And I think it's interesting that you pointed out in the sense of the car making the choice, which I think is huge. So my background is IO psychology, industrial organizational psychology. And to me, the history of my field and the history of engineering and machines is just so profoundly overlapped, because we have machines that we're trying to make more like humans, which then opens up humans' ideas to like, oh, humans are kind of like machines, which means we can study them and understand them. So that's where my field actually originates, is from our advancements in technology and our understanding of like computer, like we come up with computers, the first computer, Ada, and all of that. Suddenly we think, oh, humans have calculators in their brains. We can figure out humans now. Or you come up with like a mechanical system like automata, which were like garden structures that would move with water flowing through them. And then we think, oh, humans have stuff flowing through them that can make them move. We can understand humans now. So there's this combo of trying to make machines be like humans, and trying to understand humans as we learn about making machines like humans. So to me, the overlap is so much fun, but it also it leads to those things where people then think this machine is human, or speak to them, personification of machines. And when we talk about, so that's just that's the background thought of why I'm fascinated by this. But then when you do personify the machine, you give it kind of that, not just autonomy, but responsibility. So is that machine ready to own its own responsibility? Like, not really. I mean, it's a machine. But if you flip it to like a human driver, say, and you're like, is the human ready to own the responsibility? No. And we forgive them that choice too, even though theoretically the human is capable of the choice where the machine might not be. The choice to assume responsibility, that's what I'm saying, not the choice of who to prioritize in a situation. But we almost forgive humans the responsibility of having chosen. So we can forgive a human for making a split-second decision about who to save in an accident, or how to adhere to traffic rules and things like that, because we're like, well, they're human. But a machine gets no forgiveness. They had no responsibility, they had no choice, and they get no forgiveness because they're a machine. That's first thoughts. Ready to dig.
Two things come to my mind. All of that, the tendency to say we're like machines, or the pushback that says no, we're nothing like machines. It really, I guess, more than anything for me, underscores our lack of understanding of what we are and who we are, and how important these kinds of conversations are from across the gamut, from the philosophical to the neuropsychological. Really understanding what it means to be a human is an important part, perhaps, of being a human, right? It kind of inadvertently brings us back to, I think, therefore I am, and self-awareness, and what are other operative definitions of alive. And then going the other way with it, I liked your thoughts that as soon as you talk about choice, it brings with it the notion of responsibility. And so I wonder, is that a very human construct, or is that in fact an emerging operative definition for intelligence, that to say something is alive or intelligent means that it must have both choice and sense of responsibility? Or again, is that just some contrived construct that enables humans to function because it underpins our social independence, our social interdependence?
And then also, while you guys were talking about autonomous like machines and then responsibility and decision making, that reminded me of I don't know if you guys know, but like Sophia, like the humanoid robot by Hanson Robotics, right? Is it Hanson Robotics? Yes, it's them. And so in 2017, they were actually granted, like the robot Sophia, she was granted citizenship by the Saudi Arabian Kingdom, and she's the first like robot to be given like legal personhood anywhere in the world. So that was like really interesting to me because like with citizenship, like I hold 2 citizenships in 2 countries, like the US and then Bangladesh, and then those are very like defining to me, like they define my identity and who I am as a person, like the rights that I have, right? And then with citizenship also you have legal rights, and to give a robot legal rights, like what does that mean? Like citizens here in the US, like we have the right to vote, so does that mean Sophia could vote? Does she even, I don't even know how she's programmed, so does she make the decision, or does like the people who programmed her, are they like making the ultimate decisions? And another thing that was really interesting to me is I read this article somewhere about like social rights that citizens have too, and like specifically the way US citizenship works. If you have children in this country, then by birth they are citizens, right? And so like there was this, I forgot what school, I think it's the North Dakota like State University, but they created a robot that self-replicates using 3D printing technologies. So what if Sophia had that capability? Can she, if she self-replicates, are those also citizens of Saudi Arabia? Like how does that work? And that was just like a bunch of thoughts that I had about, you know, like robot rights, autonomy, responsibility. I just wanted to throw that in there in the mix.
Yeah, I'll second Lakeland because it's in the chat. Lakeland types in big letters, so many good questions. Yeah, yes, Nafisa, yeah, it's true. The landscape is super interesting and it's not new, right? We've had discussions for the last 2 decades about the legal rights of, well, for a century or more now, but the legal rights of corporations, and for decades now about the legal rights of natural objects like rivers and mountains and ecosystems. One distinction we're making here is the distinction between rights and responsibilities. So just because a thing has rights, let's stick with a legal case for a minute, doesn't necessarily mean it has responsibilities. There's something else that happens when you say a thing has responsibilities. A thing can have rights, like a corporation or a river or a mountain or maybe Sophia, and that really just means that X can act on behalf of her, or that Sophia is legally considerable. And if you want to shift that to the moral landscape, right, the language of moral considerability, the target of things we owe moral consideration, used to be just one another. Well, it used to be a limited subset of one another, and then one another, and then non-human animals maybe are included, and then some lakes and rivers, and now in ecosystems, and now maybe robots like Sophia, right? So I think when we're talking about rights, the rights story has been extended out quite far. The second question, and the more interesting question to me, is the one Ali started us on, and that is like, where does responsibility lie? Like if a thing has rights, how does it also get responsibilities? I'm assuming that everybody here is not an autonomous robot, although it's hard to tell because I only see you via Zoom now. But basically, like, you know, I know you have responsibilities and rights, and you have rights because of the legal context and because of our moral context. Like I owe you something, or I owe you the denial of some things like pain and suffering, for instance, whatever. But then the second question is, I assume you have responsibilities, and those are encoded also in legal and moral frameworks. But the question is like, where does responsibility come from? And I think that's a really interesting ethical question.
Yeah, for sure.
So Nafisa, let me throw it back on you. Like, where do you think responsibility? What's the seat of responsibility? Where does that come from?
I'd say it's based off of like social, like the society that you're in. Like if you're a member of society, then you have responsibilities to like one another in like within your family if you started like in small groups, and then if you were to expand, you have responsibilities in your community, um and then you have responsibilities like for your nation, and then yeah, I feel like any society or any group that you're a part of, you would grant you responsibilities. So for like Sophia to be granted personhood and citizenship, I feel like because now she's included in a group or a society, she has responsibilities.
Okay, I want to stick on this, Nafisa, but let me just say, Ali plugged a TEDx talk, which you should all watch. And I could read you the link, but I'll also send it by email to everybody afterwards in case you're not getting the chat along with the plug. But Ali, do you want to say what your TEDx talk is about?
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, I said it was shameless, but I'm a little bit ashamed to plug it. So the TEDx talk itself is actually on interdisciplinary work. So it's really taking the idea of we're trying to design autonomous vehicles, both aircraft and self-driving cars. And I was working with a computer science professional who was working with these questions. And the purpose of the project that we're doing and continue to evolve is about user acceptance of autonomous vehicles. And it's broken down into what do people care about? So what all are the factors? So it's not exactly directly related to this question of what matters when it comes to assuming responsibility, but it's very similar. It's related because it's examining what more of us, the society and individuals within it, consider important when they choose to step into, choose to own, choose to engage with AI or in this case, self-driving cars. So things like, do we care about regulations? Do I care about the expertise of the designer? Do I care about to what degree is my personal safety really relevant? To what degree do I trust? And so the talk itself is about our interdisciplinary team coming together, because that was really where we had more knowledge that we were hoping to share in that forum, because we have it. The question opens up with an engineer, a psychologist, and an accountant get into a car, who drives? And that's the basis of our talk as we go through. There's actually 3 of us in this talk, which was important for that interdisciplinary, so that we could examine this concept as examined through different ones of us. So we talk more about how we worked together, but the project focuses more on how people think about what they care about when it comes to the design of these AI programs. And, preemptive conclusions or assumptions, hypotheses really are that people care about different things. Humans are different, and we're going to have greater emphasis. So what we're trying to do is understand what they care about and the degree to which it impacts some of the decisions they'll make about using it. The evolution of that project is, a year and a half, 2 years in, it hits us that we're like, oh my gosh, we're putting the responsibility on the user. Why are we not doing this with the designer? Like, why are we not actually starting with the designer is designing these things? So what they care about is inherently going to be embedded in their design. So that's the evolution of our project, is now we're treating the same things with a designer perspective and how that impacts what they choose to do. So this question of, what makes somebody have the right, or a machine have the right to be a citizen to be a driver in this case, or to be like, what do people care about? So if it's like the ability to replicate oneself, That's great. Or is it the assumed ability to care about one's replication? That's a different assumption. So it's really just, that's where I wanted to share the project, is that this isn't just for the users of these things. This isn't just for the designers of these things. This isn't just for my perspective or your perspective. That's why it's such a complicated question. It really isn't this choice that we're programming the car to make. It is the fact that we are all driven by our own choices in different ways. Driven, haha, sorry.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, to push that, Ellie, towards the ethics side, I mean, I think when we're thinking about, there's a view of ethics that just suggests the right thing to do is the thing that we reach by community consensus. And so understanding what people value and why, like eventually that's going to lead us to some sort of consensus building, and we'll decide the right thing for a self-driving car to do is X. And maybe, Nafisa, that's one answer to your question about responsibility, or the question I posed to you, like, why does this particular robot, like, why does Sophia have personhood? Well, it's because of community consensus, right? And again, this is probably legal personhood. There's a little bit of a different terrain to push that to moral personhood, but the idea is the same on the something like a contractualist read, that ethics is the thing we agree to. So the right thing to do vis-a-vis Sophia the robot is something we reach by community. And I don't really know how I feel about that. I mean, it certainly seems pragmatically the way that we make decisions regularly, for better or worse, right? We elect, in the US, we elect representatives to represent us in legislative bodies. Those bodies make decisions by something akin to consensus building. I'm making stuff up now, but you get the idea, right? In the ideal world, that's how we make policy decisions, is by more or less a consensus building process. And yet, you know all the problems with that, right? On the legal side of the house, when we're working by consensus, what people want and what they value is incredibly malleable. If we've learned anything from Allie's work, the work of folks in Allie's field, and work of moral psychologists and the like, is that, you know, the values we hold are shaped by all of these factors external to us. And to suggest that the right thing to do is always just the thing that we reach by consensus puts us on kind of shaky ground. One might argue, and I guess now there's a lot of bias coming from me, but yeah, it's super interesting. So again, if the rights are the thing that we attribute to something, that we give to something legally or morally, then the responsibility is something that the thing has, based on some capacity it has, perhaps. Nafisa, you started, in your example, you said responsibility came from sort of group membership. So once Sophia is now a citizen, or at least a legal person, then she has responsibilities. And before that, she was just a robot, didn't have any responsibilities. And that's super interesting, right? Because nothing about Sophia has changed necessarily. In this landscape, again, I feel like I'm just asking questions, but I think it's really interesting. You all also got me thinking about this swan. I heard about this years ago, and anyway, this clock builder in 1773 built a swan, a mechanical swan that swims in a pond, eats a fish. Like, it's got this incredibly realistic thing. Here, I'll post a Smithsonian magazine link about it. Yeah, maybe it poops. Does it poop, Allie? That would be fantastic. I don't know.
That's the automata that I was thinking about in some ways too, and I am sure it could be a swan duck 17th century idea. But yeah, the one I'm thinking of is called a defecating duck because it eats a food pellet and it goes through the system and it then releases said pellet.
This one like swims in the pond and the water moves and the plants move and the duck moves its neck and preens and then eats a fish. And again, this is just like a literal wind up with a key clock mechanism made out of silver and brass. And yet it's a really interesting thing to think about because that's a really complicated mechanical system that still has a human input, but otherwise acts autonomously. you might argue. And then the interesting philosophical question is, what's the difference between that and Sophia from the Feces example and self-driving cars that we're talking about now? Like, is autonomy just a function of complexity? And then back to Ellie's point, does that mean that we're just super complicated machines and that really, in the end, there's no difference apart from complexity between me and the defecating duck? Frankly, there's not a lot of difference between me and a defecating duck, but this mechanical one is the one I'm interested in specifically. And we're not answering questions here. We're just asking them. So feel free to contribute more questions.
I guess for me, responsibility follows choice. And so I think Allison mentioned about, if it was a human being who made a mistake, then we would forgive them. But I think we kind of look at it at a spectrum, right? So was it an intentional conduct, which would be a true choice? And then you would hold that person at a higher accountability. Or was it more like a mistake, a negligence, and then you would hold them at a lesser degree of accountability? So for me, it is about choice and the ability to make a choice. So if it's a autonomous car or something, I don't see that having the choice. I mean, it basically performs how it's designed. So that's how I kind of view it. And I think it sort of, for me, the example I can give you is that when the ATM machines came about, and it took me forever to use one of those because I always preferred to go in and have a person. So if there was any question or a discrepancy, there would be a person that I could go to. And that was because, again, you cannot really interact and have a discussion with an ATM machine, but you could always go to a person. And so I think that's sort of my thoughts on choice and responsibility.
Thanks, Shaynor. I really like that. The idea that responsibility is linked up to choice seems to be a really good thread to pull on for a second. Because in bioethics, right, we're making distinctions between asking consent and asking assent based on somebody's perceived autonomy. So in the case of research involving children, we assume that children can't offer consent, both for legal reasons, but also for developmental reasons. Like they're not capable, perhaps, of being informed in the right way or understanding what's going on. And so we're asking their guardians, we're asking them to assent, and then asking their guardians for consent, right? This is a much more complicated process for involving children. And so maybe what we're doing here is just suggesting that autonomous vehicles, cars in this case, or maybe Sophia the robot, are kind of akin to children in that they have choice. And now we're talking maybe on Dr. Kubler's specific intelligence, like Blue Devil, Little Blue, Big Blue, the Blue, Old Blue. What's the name of the chess playing robot? I've lost it now.
Deep Blue.
Deep Blue. Deep Blue. Deep Blue. Deep Blue is a specific intelligence, can make choice, but in the way that a child can, like in this relatively limited, still complex, but relatively limited way. And so therefore, on Shaynor's argument, we're going to assign Deep Blue, Big Blue, Little Blue, whatever it is, a little bit of responsibility or a limited sense of responsibility, and not as much as you and I might have, only because of the complexity of our decision making, the complexity of our choice.
But how are we defining and conceptualizing making a choice, right? And like, what does it mean to choose and to make a choice? Because I really like what was said earlier, where we, tying it all to choice, but the ability to make a choice, I think is really like, that keeps looping around in my head. And I really love that whole kind of construction. But like, and I'm thinking, okay, let's go back to the self-driving cars. Let's say you get in a self-driving car and you say, take me to wherever, the cinema, the library, whatever. And internally, the car routes like 5 different options. One's fastest, one doesn't take you on the toll roads because, where you're in Florida, whatever, right? So like there's different options. If the car just like goes on one versus any of the other, right? Like if we're talking humans here, we would say, okay, the person chose, right, to take option route A or route 1 or route fastest. Would we say the same thing about the car, that the car chose to take route fastest or route cheapest or route whatever? Because then what happens if you do that and you're late? You end up being late to whatever you're going to. You're late to the movie, whatever. Do you then blame the car for making you late because of the choice that it made to take you there? So like, I don't know. I just, that whole thing of like ability to choose and like, what does it mean to choose something? Like, how are we defining, conceptualizing choice? I don't know. It's so just more questions, more things to consider, I guess. But yeah, that's where my brain went.
Yeah, Lakeland, I agree with you. I actually have exactly those words written down because the ability to make a choice is such a fascinating thing to think about, and not to fold in too much to blow our minds, but it is interesting to acknowledge that context matters, right? So even the fastest route is going to be different based on if there's something that's slowing down the route, those sorts of things. So I think to also bring back in kind of that reference to the forgiveness that we actually give a human where we wouldn't give a machine, even if we give a machine acknowledgement that they're allowed to make choices, we don't give them the forgiveness for making a choice wrong that's related to context. So if it chooses the fastest route and then there's an accident, then do we get mad at it for not choosing a faster route? Do we get mad at but I think the idea with these questions about, like which order of kill for an autonomous vehicle is the most appropriate is that in essence, we're having to make choices ahead of the context in which they're given. So that's where it's, when we're talking about programming or creating algorithms for a thing to make decisions, we as a designer maybe have to account for the context, but we can't account for all context because we're quote human, right? So we forgive a human in the moment for not, like we'd blame the context as a human. We'd be like, well, I did choose the fastest route, but something happened along the way and I couldn't do that. Or I don't make left-hand turns. And so I had to choose the slower route. So it's because of the left-hand turns, not because I chose the slower route. Whereas that machine, it's so tempting to blame the machine instead of recognizing that the machine is constricted by context as well. And the decisions that it's programmed to make are constricted by the contexts that may be even more constricted because, again, we don't know all of the context it's going to be in.
Right. Like I'm tracking with you on that. And like that's what I'm saying though. I think that like we would assign responsibility, right? Like let's take ourselves out of the decision-making process, right? Because yeah, like I'm gonna, theoretically people are gonna make any excuse to like save face, right? Like, oh, of course it wasn't my fault that I'm late. Of course it was like all these other things. But like let's put a person navigator in the side, right? Okay, so that person, our co-pilot, our person riding in the passenger seat, they're navigating us to the cinema, and they, we end up being late because of the choices that they told us to make. A conversation would probably be had about why did you say to go this way when we could have gone that way, or like, why did you, whatever. So we would have that conversation, that dialogue, or even cast blame, right, on yes, on our Uber driver, or on the passenger who's navigating us. And I think in the same way we would cast the blame on the machine, right? Which is, I guess what I'm saying is, like, we possibly would account responsibility and accountability to machines. So I don't think there's this complete like aversion of, oh no, we would never give a machine responsibility or accountability, because I think in like contexts like that, like we absolutely would, just like we would like a human co-navigator person or something. So I don't know if that's fruitful to the conversation, but just, I don't know.
Let me just, sorry, Austin, do you want to
go? You can go if you had something related to this, because I might be taking this in a little bit of a different direction.
Okay, hold your thought. I don't want you to lose it. I want to just try to make a distinction that I hear coming out in the conversation between Allie and Lakeland. So we had this definition that we'd offered temporarily, that responsibility is this ability to make a choice. And that's a positive, sort of agential focused definition of responsibility. It's the thing's capacity to choose. So it's like an argument from autonomy, maybe. But an alternative definition is maybe a relational definition. So responsibility is a thing, it's a condition, a capacity a thing has if I can assign it forgiveness or blame. So it doesn't matter what its capacity is. It doesn't matter if it can choose. It's whether or not I can assign it forgiveness or blame. So like when assume I had a dog, my dog tears up my couch, right? I can blame that dog and I can forgive that dog, we might think. If my robotic vacuum cleaner eats my rug, the choice differential is very different between my dog and the robot vacuum, I think. We could talk about why, but it seems like that's a thing. But it seems like I'm not going to assign forgiveness or blame to my vacuum in the same way that I am to my dog. And so I just wanted to point out that I think there's like two competing definitions. There's this positive sort of definition based on attributes of a thing, its capacity to make a choice, and then maybe a relational definition that doesn't have to do with the thing's capacity, but on my relationship to it. And I think those are complementary or competing. I'm not sure yet, but just wanted to point it out. Austin, go.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that kind of potential alternative to responsibility, because that I think might tie in a little bit to what I was going to bring up. So maybe I come into this conversation with too different of a mindset to track the route y'all are going down, because I have a very utilitarian, very pragmatic, very I don't want to say consequentialist worldview, but it leans that way sometimes, and that's that I'm not sure it's always super useful to, and maybe this is just a different topic than what we're talking about here, but I'm not sure how useful assigning blame to an inanimate object is at the end of the day. But what I am interested in is, so let's say that I have somewhere to be, later in the night, but I want to go and drink, okay? When I go and decide to consume alcohol, assuming I'm a law-abiding citizen, I am already yielding that I am not going to be driving, and therefore I have already given up my control over getting where I need to go next, assuming that I'm, following the law and not going to drive drunk after drinking, let's say. Maybe there's a better analogy in here somewhere. But so I am already giving up my ability to have direct control over when I get to my next destination. And I feel like when you're talking about should you blame the car for getting you there late, in that podcast or the video that EE talk, they talked about how humans really like something to point the finger at, to blame, but they also talked about how for a long time you should expect to see kind of a mix of autonomous vehicles and fully manual vehicles, in that it'll probably be a long time until you see people buying a vehicle that is only autonomous. You know, there's going to be a lot of times where you have the ability to drive your car yourself. And I feel like when you choose to put it in autonomous mode, that at the end of the day, the choice that was made, because I don't see inanimate objects as valid actors personally to assign blame to, at least not in a pragmatic sense. I think at the end of the day, the choice was made by you to that you were late. You know, that you yielded that choice, but you still chose to yield that choice, if that makes sense. On top of that, it's kind of similar to, oh well, maybe you would have driven there slower if you were driving yourself because the vehicle is more optimized. Well, right now we live in a society where, let's assume there were no autonomous vehicles on the road yet. You have to leave your house early enough to make it somewhere in time, and if you misjudge how long it's going to take, the responsibility is still on you for being late. And I don't think that changes whether you're driving the car manually or whether your choice is made when you get in the car and flip the switch to autonomous. I still think it's only rational from my point of view to look at humans as actors in this situation. Now, this is more a conversation about responsibility. My opinions on liability in the event of an accident is kind of a different thing, but I think that is further removed from what we're talking about, and I don't want to, with only 10 minutes left, go down that rabbit hole, because I think it requires a very political discussion about how we look at our road infrastructure. And I'm trying. I don't think we have enough time to make this conversation political, whether or not we should or not.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I think I've always tried to steer clear of the liability side of these discussions because I'm not a lawyer. And frankly, like, the ethics side is so complicated on its own. But anytime we talk about pragmatics, Austin, I think, like, the way we make decisions in the world is informed both constrained by the legal and informed by the ethical. So both of those are really important. I want to follow up with what you said, because, like, you got me thinking more about this idea of relational responsibility, the idea that, it's weird to assign blame to an object or a self-driving car, which is animate, but in a different kind of way. The pushback, the possible counter I wanted to give you is maybe from an alternative to your own example. So imagine you and U prime go into the bar, right? Or let's not make it about you, Austin. Let's say Tina and Tina prime. So Tina goes to the bar, right? Tina's a responsible adult. She goes to drink. She knows she's not going to drive home. She takes whatever it is to get home. She goes home. Now, if she flips the switch in an autonomous vehicle, your argument was she accepts responsibility. She's responsible, not the car, because she's made the choice. But now imagine Tina prime, right? Tina prime is a responsible adult, except that Tina prime is an alcoholic, right? She's got an addiction problem. And her addiction problem stems from a long history of mental, psychological abuse from family members dating back decades. And she doesn't have a very strong support network here in Central Florida. So Tina prime is going to the bar to drink. Tina prime is still going to get an autonomous vehicle and is still going to flip the switch, all the same, all else being equal. It's weird, though, to think that Tina and Tina prime are equally autonomous or equally individually responsible, right? The Tina prime example is supposed to suggest that even you and I are all relationally autonomous, right? That my decisions are informed by this network of folks that I've got around me, support networks, my histories, my physiology, like everything about me is relational. So we do legally assign blame to me if I get in a car accident, and yet, like, it's not just me that's led to that decision point, right? It's not like any of us is standalone, isolatably autonomous. And I wonder what that does for the autonomous car argument. Like, is there a sense in which we might say, well, yeah, driver, you flipped the switch to go into Tesla's autonomous mode and fell asleep at the wheel. We've all seen those videos, right? On the highway. So yeah, that's on you. And yet Tesla gave you the conditions to be able to do that. So there has to be some kind of relational responsibility. I don't know, Austin, if you would buy that argument or not.
That in part has to do with where I would divide responsibility and liability there, though. which I don't want to get too far into that, but essentially I think you almost need to look at a more holistic view of how we look at infrastructure in this country, and maybe even make some share in these companies. You know, I might be getting too close to being political here, but basically, I think you maybe need some sort of conglomerate of liability here. You almost need if the more advanced this gets, I feel like you almost need some whole to accept liability, kind of the way that police departments serve to accept large amounts of liability, or there's got to be some better examples in here, but there's plenty of places where we do this now, where we kind of merge a lot of things or make things public for the sake of it makes it actually possible or realistic to assign liability one place or another rather than breaking them up. But like I said, I think this is too political of a rabbit hole to go down.
Austin, I'm happy to help with this part of the conversation too, because it's hitting on what I wanted to go back to of what you originally stated. And you kind of mentioned that you had like a utilitarian or a consequentialism. And that had me flipping into this idea of like, okay, where would we take this? And also relating back to that, the right thing to do is what we reach by community consensus idea. And I want to remind us that we do ride in self-driving vehicles at this point in our lives. So it's not actually new. We do. Like, you go to Dallas Fort Worth, you have to ride the air tram, the sky cab between places. And when I say have to, I pretty much mean have to. Like, you want to get from terminal A to terminal E, you got to get on those. It's a long walk otherwise, and I'm not even sure it's possible. So in a lot of ways, we have these things, we have rails, we have systems. They're different from an individual car, which I think is why we're in an interesting place. And we also don't have the infrastructure yet to allow for these individualized autonomous cars. But that is, in some ways, makes us realize we're actually on the precipice of something that will potentially down the road become more of a community having decision. And I think that's why it's such a fun, hot topic, is because we are on the precipice of this. 20 years from now, who knows? Maybe there is going to be no option on driving your own car. Maybe we'll kill the idea of AI driving our car. Who knows what's going to happen? But this is where we get the choice. Down the road, we don't get the choice of a sky cab or not. And theoretically, it's still utilitarian wise better for everybody to have this sky tram. And then, I know we're trying to keep liability out of it, but that's wise. We've had now the structure to put in the liability of, if something goes wrong with that sky cab, that's not going to be put on an individual traveler likely at this point, nor is it maybe going to go on an individual designer. Maybe it's going to so that's in there down the road, which is why I don't think it necessarily has to be the hot topic now. But it is relevant as we think about, we still have some choice. We still have some individual autonomy. We still are trying to work with a society to come to that community consensus. And we're still trying to be aware of, down the road, this may have implications for responsibility, for relationships, for individual choice versus communities better interest, that kind of thing. So I guess my last question, my last question is really like, who should decide and who should be in on these conversations? Like, how do we do that?
Well, clearly we should decide.
I was just going to say about the concept of community consensus. There is also a question about whose voice in the community matters and who makes those decisions. And so not everybody is represented equally. So is it really truly a community consensus?
I saw Lakeland finger snap, so I think that's a
You're
good
hitting all my points. You're hitting all the good stuff. Like I was writing in the chat, I was like, can we have a part 2 to this conversation? Because I have so many diverging thoughts, and that was merely one of them. So I know we have like 1 minute left. Also, I have to go because I have a meeting right at 4.
I agree that this would be a useful topic to revisit potentially.
I'm happy to do that. Again, this is part of the impetus for these discussions and the podcasts are sort of to get us primed to think. So yeah, I would be glad to do a follow-up. We'll continue these likely over the summer and through the fall. So in the meantime, friends, do well and be better, and we will see you next time.
Take care,
Thanks, everybody.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.